If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. So that enables him to take with him what he has accrued to himself, I presume. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost.
Okay, forgive me. So this is critical. There is an obvious implication that not everybody will pick up on. If the slave says, I love my master, so people will think, what kind of kook is that? A slave who loves his master. But it's not a master in the sense that we think of, like the transatlantic slave trade or ill treatment in South America, etc. This is, again, what we said earlier, indentured servitude, and it is possible he loved his master. Mm-hmm. What if he treated him well? Mm-hmm. And he has his needs taken care of, and he doesn't want to leave his wife and children. So it implies, if nothing else, the possibility that there were good people or decent people in the role of quote-unquote master.
And this enables the person to continue that service, even though in some manner he's condemned to be free by the essentially by the Sabbath lifting of the indentured servitude requirement.
But there is a subtlety here that if he comes in with his wife, he goes free with his wife in the 7th year. But if the master gives him his wife and he bears children, the wife and children stay.
Right.
So this is whatever we may think of that.
Property differentiation.
Yes, this is a way of his being able to freely stay with what he has been part of building. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't simply go with him because of this distinction in the law between whether you were given it or whether you brought it with you.
Right. It's difficult when you're explicating a text as ancient as this to understand exactly what parts you would require to be permanently applicable and what parts have to be differentiated so they were laws that were germane and relevant to a time and place. And so it's very difficult for modern people to understand anything like the morality of this set of rules because all of the conditions under which these rules were generated are so different from our conditions. But it's also hard, I guess, for people who are claiming something like the divinity of the biblical text to also say, well, this doesn't apply because it only applied to that time and place. And so,
but what the text, I mean, first of all, there's a huge distinction that might be good to make now. This God is everybody's God, the first one to say so. And he gives a law in great detail. We're going through it. It's not everybody's law. It's the Jewish law, right? And Christians think that later God will say, my kingdom is not of this world. And that means he doesn't give us laws like this. And that's an enormous change. And see, if in Islam, God is a universal God and a lawgiver. And that means the one who interprets the law has got supreme authority. It's hard to think what check there is on it. Mm-hmm. But in both Judaism and Christianity, it isn't like that. These laws are as strict and detailed as any in the ancient world, but they're just for this people. And there's a structure, by the way, of rule. This is a polity. We're founding a polity here, right? And they can be analyzed against each other according to Aristotle's categories for one. And this polity has a structure of authority that it's not absolute monarchy. It's in the beginning, it's hardly monarchy at all. And there's priests and rulers, and they offset each other. And this law is a law over them too. And so it's a very curious thing, and it gives fuel and credence to the Christian view that this is a preparation for God to rule all the earth.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We can see in the particularity of the laws the seeds of a universal understanding of all humanity, because what's different from the codes that came before is that we don't have it's not just an abolition of distinctions among classes. It's just it's very clear that there is no longer any category of human being that is, as it were, enslaved. That servitude is sort of part of what it is to be that category of human being, and so we should see it really, I think, in developmental terms. We're seeing what we need to do is compare with what went before, and we need to understand the kind of trajectory of the moral universe of Israel towards the universalism that we find later on.
There's a phenomenon that Egyptologists described as the democratization of Osiris and Horus. And so the pharaoh in Egypt was conceptualized as the union of Osiris and Horus. So Osiris was the god of the state, who could become willfully blind to the machinations of evil, who was once great in his youth, but who developed this ossification across time. That's the problem of tradition. And then Horus is the visionary revitalizer who journeys to the underworld and revitalizes the father. And the Egyptians conceptualized the pharaoh, the sovereignty of the pharaoh, as the union of Osiris and Osiris. So it's the union of tradition and vision. And then, to begin with, only the pharaoh could use the symbolism that was associated with Osiris and Horus, but then the aristocracy began to pick it up. And they call that the democratization of Osiris. And you can think of what happened among the Jews as an extension of that. It's a spreading down of the idea of sovereignty and intrinsic value itself down to the hoi polloi, you might say.
I think there's a parallel to this. If I'm not mistaken, in Babylonian political theology, the phrase image of God, or something very like it, was confined to the king, the Babylonian king. It looks as if what may be happening in the early chapters of Genesis is that you've got a similar process of democratization as the image of God shifts from king to all human beings.
And that's, again, that parallels also the abstraction of the idea of sovereignty. So sovereignty is no longer what a king does. It's in the nature of the king. And then once you understand to some degree that it's in the nature of the king, then you can think, well, maybe that kingly nature is distributed more widely than you might have assumed to begin with, and then maybe eventually it's part and parcel of everyone.
All earthly sovereignty is relative sovereignty, and then it's, as it were, distributed sovereignty.
And the principle of sovereignty is equivalent between every individual. There's something in you that's sovereign, there's something in me that's sovereign. Our proper relationship is one of sovereign to sovereign, and with that you also start to ground the idea of the sovereignty of the people, the true sovereignty of the people, and the idea that the leader is now someone, this eventually happens, is now someone who serves that distributed sovereignty in the people, and is subordinate to that.
So we see here really a revolution in the history of moral thought.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish.
Well, modern people, they think often, well, we don't believe these things anymore. And I think, well, you act it out. So it's not so obvious you don't believe it. You don't want to be around someone who doesn't treat you or the people you love as if they're sovereign individuals with no free will, with no intrinsic dignity. None of your relationships are going to work, and they're certainly not going to be desirable unless they're predicated on that principle. So the idea that you don't believe it simply isn't true. And if there isn't something that's under that belief, which is a recognition of the transcendent dignity of the individual, then you think, well, that belief in you is weak, right? It's got no foundation. On what grounds do you posit that? And that makes it vulnerable to disruption. So,
but a lot of people could hear what you're both saying and interpret it in an evolutionary framework, that we have a slow evolution of religion, and the Jews are rising a little higher than the Babylonians and the Egyptians. I think that's wrong. I think this is genuinely revolutionary because of revelation, as we were talking yesterday. So you've got this double contrast. Egypt behind you, monarchy, hierarchy, tyranny, slavery. And here's a covenantal way of doing things. Michael Walzer calls it an almost democracy. All the people buy in, and it applies to all the people. And there's no classes here.
There's still servitude.
There's a priestly class.
Well,
there's still a caste. There's just not. There's at least two castes. There's a priestly caste.
And they are?
There is a priestly caste in
so that's
Israel.
interesting. I'm not even challenging. I'm very curious. You think that in the eyes of the Israelite, The priest was like the Brahmin in Hinduism. That was the upper class.
I don't know if it was the upper class, but it was a distinct hereditary class.
Correct.
Yeah.
But okay, so hereditary and caste are co-equal or synonymous?
It's just a separation of function within
Oh,
society.
okay.
Like
Of
clear
course, you're
Write me
separation.
a separation of function without separation of value.
Right, that's the
That's
key. That's
possible.
my
Right.
question.
Right. Well, that might distinguish a caste from
they
a
are
function.
of equal value. No,
But differentiated.
Jews never thought that the priest was more valuable.